He had been in ministry for 15 years. His church was vibrant. He was considered successful, but success wasn't bringing him any comfort. Everything looked great on the surface, he said, but underneath, I felt like a phony, going through the motions. I was struggling with God and ill at ease. One night, H.B. London said, in a dark, silent church when no one was present, I fell across the altar in a mood of spiritual desperation. I began to pray the most humiliating prayer imaginable. God, he said, I want out of ministry. I'm not worthy of this church. I'm not real. I'm a play actor. Get me out of this. And I would appreciate it if you would get me out of it gracefully. But if it's not graceful, that's okay too. I just can't go on with this pain inside. And he went on to tell God that he was inauthentic and inadequate and unworthy and full of cracks and holes and running on spiritual empty. And in that moment, London says, something happened. The presence of Christ came over me like never before. And I felt this empowerment like I'd never felt, as if God said, now I can use you. And what happened, he said, changed his whole life and his ministry. You know, sometimes in the mainline church, we're guilty of downplaying the role of the Spirit and the transformative and the emotional and the spiritual aspects of Christianity. Sometimes we forget that God can work deep inside of us and can affect deep, deep aspects of our lives and vitalize and revitalize and change our faith and how we live. One of the great dangers, and I include myself in this, is that we can become too intellectually minded when it comes to Christianity. We love theological thinking and study and ideas, and these ideas can sometimes challenge the faith and leave us bereft of spirit. Other people will exist in the social realm of church life, and they will look after others, and their religion becomes looking after others with perhaps not that much room for God. And then there are many people in churches who just get tired, and after perhaps years and years of going to church week after week, a degree of monotony kind of settles in, and you can get tired, and faith becomes a bit dull, and many things happen to people in the journey. And I'm wondering if we recognize in H.B. London's account something that perhaps some of us need to fan a little bit the flames of faith that perhaps we once had to get us going again. I wonder if we ourselves sometimes need to be transformed and renewed and enlivened and something to make us vibrant as Christians. Over the past 10 years, I've been spending at least some of my holidays, including this year, in Southampton on Lake Huron. And didn't happen this year, but sometimes we would have fires by the lake, on the shore, of course. And people would collect driftwood and a bit of kindling and a bit of paper, and we'd get a fire going. And it was great to just sit around the fire and to chat and listen to the crackles of the wood and see the leaping flames and moonlight out there and Perhaps we would sing a few songs with a guitar, or we would just enjoy the atmosphere and the time and the people. I remember it was a couple of years ago at one of these, the fire started to die out, and I wasn't quite ready to turn in, so I threw a couple of extra logs on the fire. 10 minutes later, I realized these logs aren't catching. And so I thought I'd throw in an extra piece of newspaper or so. And what happened was the newspaper burned really quickly. It just sort of flamed up, and then things went back to normal. The fire was dying. So I thought I'd get some kindling, put some more kindling on these embers to try and get it going. Left it for a few minutes, but that wasn't catching either. And finally, I decided that I better do something more active. And I got down on my knees and I started to blow on the embers and sort of put the kindling wood, the thin bits of it, in certain places. And slowly, a little flame came up, then a bit more flame, and then a bit more. And eventually the fire started again, and we were able to enjoy another half hour or 40 minutes or so of fire time. Good company. It's like that with fires. Sometimes when they die down, it takes a little bit of work and a little bit of fanning of the flames or the embers to get them going again. And maybe it's like that with Christian faith. There are times when it begins to die down and it fades and it can get monotonous, or questions are causing it to fade, and it needs to get going again. When Paul wrote to Timothy, it seems that Timothy, his faith was in need of some sort of renewal. He talks about the strong faith that Timothy had grown up with, faith that was in his grandmother, faith that was in his mother, now him. But it also says, Timothy, rekindle the gift of God that is within you through the laying on of hands. And it's as if Paul was saying, fan the flames a little bit. Fan those embers. Rekindle that gift that you once had. Be open to renewal. Be open to the grace of God, to being reawakened and having that passion again for faith. Now, 2 Timothy is another one of Paul's letters written during a time of imprisonment. And Paul was alone. His friends had deserted him, he says. He's staring, it seems, in the face of death, imprisoned. And if church tradition has it right, he was in Rome. And it was during the darker days of the Emperor Nero. And Nero was the first emperor to really start a widespread persecution of Christians. He blamed them for the great fire in Rome. And the Roman historian Tacitus wrote in his annals of the horrors of this. He said some Christians were covered in the hides of animals and torn apart by dogs. And he said others were nailed to crosses, others set on fire to light up the night. And if Paul was in Rome there, he would have known about these things, and wondering if he faced a similar threat. But as you read Paul's letters, not only here, but elsewhere, Paul's not so concerned about his own life as he is about the gospel, and that this good news would continue to be preached. And he's thinking to himself, well, I may not be able to take the gospel into the future, but Timothy, you can. And he implores Timothy. And yet he knows that Timothy's faith has sort of settled down a bit, lost some of its gusto and his willingness to serve. He says this faith needs to be rekindled. And we're never told what Timothy's issue was. Perhaps he was frightened by what was going on in Rome. Maybe he saw Paul in prison, and he said, well, I don't want that. I don't want to be hanging around with all those cons. Maybe he saw the persecution. He said, I don't want that either. Whatever it was, he's troubled. Stepped back, no longer had the same drive. And Paul says, don't be ashamed of this gospel or me as a prisoner, but join with me, even if it means suffering. Rely on the power of God. Power of God that has brought to light immortality. Rekindle the gift that God has given you. You know, as I read that text, I sometimes wonder about the church and if that is something we need in our denomination. Is that something we need as individuals? The Spirit to transform, to awaken, to enliven. I was reading a while ago Callum Brown's book called The Death of Christian Britain. And it's absolutely amazing that the decline that has faced the British church since probably the 1950s. Astonishing. Secularism has taken control, multiculturalism, pluralism taken over. And the picture on the front cover of this book tells the story. It is a picture of what at some point was a proud and beautiful church building. Halfway up the wall is a large poster that says Carpet Warehouse. And unfortunately, much of Europe and some parts of North America are in the same boat. We've entered this age when Christians have become a minority in the culture. People are feeling uneasy about Christian faith, let alone declaring it. Faith viewed as something private. We don't want to be labeled different or intellectually inferior, and so we've sort of taken away the radicalness of Christianity and made it safe. So much so that people begin to wonder, well, what's the point of Christian faith and church? Why bother? Why bother? Pluralism. It's probably one of the things that's undercut Christianity the most. It tends to treat, you hear this. You hear it in your news broadcasts and everywhere. Pluralism tends to treat all worldviews, all religions as equals, meaningful only for those who espouse them. It undercuts any idea of truth that we can have and something that is uniquely or absolutely true. There aren't any absolutes. Things like religion or anything else, nothing has any objective reality. And you'll hear that. Politicians will say it, telling us that, religions are all equal. And this sounds good. Sounds good to the ear, sounds politically correct. But when people espouse ideas like that, there are all kinds of presuppositions with them. And as many young people embrace them, they find that there's not much point in committing to anything, so they don't become members of anything. And there isn't much point in committing to religion or the church. And we all face that with our children. Now, I don't want to get into a big critique of pluralism today. Suffice it to say that it has problems with logic. For instance, I remember when I was teaching at a university, and this girl came in to question something about a paper that she had written, and I started asking her about something about truth, and she said, "But there is no truth." And I said, "Is that true?" See, it has problems, this pluralism. But what I want to go on and say is that Christianity Christianity has always couched itself in events and realities that have strong evidential support. There's a lot to be said about Jesus and what happened. All the accounts are always associated with eyewitnesses and people who were there. They didn't have things like tape recorders and phones that they could record things on. It was eyewitnesses that were the way things were passed on. And always eyewitnesses are referred to in passages in our Gospels and in the letters. And people were experiencing Christ. They were experiencing the risen Christ, and it was changing them. It was transforming their lives. There was some power connected with it. It awakened them, strengthened them, instilled things in them. Real people, real change. And these things were occurring in the 1st century, and they occurred in the 5th century, and they occurred in the 10th century, and the 15th century, and the 20th century, and they still occur today in some places. And they give, the Spirit comes and gives vitality and awakens people. And I was telling the children about it. It was like putting glasses on. Suddenly I saw God in a different way. This happens. And sometimes we forget. I was handed a report a while ago about a church that was attempting to make sure that their church survived the great disappearance of Christian churches from our culture and society. And the report described the church as doing better than most churches. There was a realization, however, that congregation was aging and it was looking for a roadmap into the future. And it wanted to reignite its own community into action so that they would attract people, they said, to the truly awesome and living experience of Christian faith in action. It went on to talk about how they had a bold mission to provide an awesome and transforming experience of God's love. And it asked, do we walk and talk as a faith community like we are on a mission? Do we use words like thriving, fiercely, passionately, joyously, innovatively, boldly, dynamically, challenging, changing, growing, faithfully? Do we use these words to describe our own faith community and what we believe and what we're here to do? And if we're not using them regularly, they said, it's time to start. We need to get on with our mission in the world. We need to be awakened. Now, lest you think that's crazy, that is a United Church in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And somehow this congregation has realized that they need to rekindle their faith and what they're about as a church. And they have moved beyond things like pluralism and recognized again that there's something very special about Jesus Christ. Recovered their sense of mission, and they're asking others to get on board. And as I read that document, I think the Spirit is at work. Renewal. A couple of years ago, I knelt down and I started blowing on the embers of a fire and put in a little bit of kindling, and that fire sprang back into life. Paul talks about doing something similar with our faith, bringing it back. And he connects it with the laying on of hands, which if you read that in the New Testament, it's always connected with the coming of the Spirit. And so I wonder, as we think of our own Christian experience, as we think of our own denomination, as we think of Eastminster, I wonder if we think enough about the spiritual aspects of the faith. Because faith without the Spirit and a church without the Spirit is nothing.